Now let's move to panel 2. So I'm asking the members of panel 2 and the chair of panel 2 to join the session. And then I give the floor to Peter MARTON from Corvinus University to chair the panel. So please, the floor is yours now.
Thank you, Csaba. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Péter MARTON. As Csaba introduced me, I'm his colleague at Corvinus University's Institute of International Political and Regional Studies. Very long name. Managed to say it correctly. I'm very happy about that. And now I'm going to, of course, briefly mention the participants of the panel, whose presentations we are very much looking forward to. And of course, this is going to be followed by a discussion. So speaking to the audience now, of course, the expectation is that you would be collecting questions and comments to our panelists for the discussion that will come afterwards. And with that, the brief introduction, I promise. So we have a panel on nuclear history and intelligence. And in fact, it's a mixture of two different types of papers, if you like. And the first two are going to be devoted to certain aspects of nuclear history in various ways. And the third paper that we have is the one that is going to deal with the topic of intelligence and the specific aspect of that. So with that, the first presenter is going to be Péter TAKÁCS from the University of Public Service. And he's going to give us a paper titled Cold War Trends in the Nuclear Age, Hannah Arendt's concept typology on the issue of total war and political revolution. And the second presenter following this is going to be Hannah KUNZE from the Columbia University, US. And the title of the paper, Hannah's paper, is Demise of the Family Unit, Parenting and Alcoholism in the Soviet Union in the Early Cold War Years. And this is followed by the third paper from Carol Louise ASHBY from Sciences Po and Columbia dual program. The paper's title is Swinging Spies, Sexpionage during the Sexual Revolution in New York and Washington, D.C. in the 1970s. I guess the audience will agree with me that we have a very interesting mix of papers, and I'm sure that in the discussion there'll be plenty of reactions because these topics basically guarantee that. And I'm pretty sure that the presentations will only add to that. So without further ado, I'm asking Péter if he is present. Péter TAKÁCS, do we have you? Okay, I'm turning now to either Professor Békés or perhaps Daniel Vékony from the panel before. So do we have confirmation that Péter TAKÁCS is missing?
Well, we have him in the list of the participants. So I wonder why he is not speaking up.
I recommend that we move forward and maybe he will join later. He has connection issues.
Oh.
Thank you. That's, of course, always expected, technical issues in the kind of environment we're in. So we will just shift the papers accordingly. And so that brings Hannah's paper forward. Hannah KUNZE, please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Just give me one moment to share my screen.
Thank you.
Sorry, hold on. Can you guys see that or no?
Something is definitely happening, and we are there.
Yeah, okay, great. All right, so you can see that as well? Okay, great. Thank you. Sorry, my laptop is, I don't know, I couldn't tell, but thank you. So thank you so much for the invitation to present today. My name's Hannah, and I'm going to be presenting my research entitled The Demise of the Family Unit, Parenting and Alcoholism in the Soviet Union in the Early Cold War Years. And I'd first like to draw your attention to this photo on the right from the New York Times in the mid-1950s. This photo will appear again at the end of the presentation, and I hope by the end of the presentation you are able to see it in somewhat of a new light. But what it...
The problem, I'm sorry to interrupt, but
No
we
worries.
can't see the photo that you mentioned. So we cannot see it at the moment. At least I, for my part, can.
Could you see like this screen switch?
No, we don't see it either.
I don't see it.
Oh.
No, it's okay.
No. Yes.
All right. Give me 1 second then.
No problem. Just take your time.
Thank you.
Okay, now we see the picture.
You see the picture, but if I
like
click...
this. So if it doesn't work,
Yes.
when you try to play the slides, you can stay in the current mode, and I think then we will be able to follow the presentation. But we can give it another try, I think, because it would definitely, be best if the presentation runs smoothly, of course.
All right, let's see. Maybe not that. Hold on.
It's a pity. I'm afraid we still don't see it.
That is interesting. Okay, well, I can just present like this. You're going to see my speaker notes at the bottom of the screen, so hopefully, well, maybe you can just ignore that.
Or you can close that, I think, in advance.
Can I?
Yeah, you can probably find some option in one of those roll-down menus.
Okay. Let me see.
Maybe in View, I think.
Oh, thank you. There we go. I appreciate that. All right. Am I good to start over now?
Yes.
All right.
Please go ahead. Yep.
Thank you, guys. Sorry for that technical difficulty. So yeah, my name is Hannah. Thank you so much for the invitation. And today I'm going to be presenting my research entitled The Demise of the Family Unit, Parenting and Alcoholism in the Soviet Union in the Early Cold War Years. And now that you can see the picture on the right, this is from the New York Times in the mid-1950s. I believe it was 1952. And hopefully you'll be able to come and see this picture in a new light by the end of the presentation. What it depicts is a Soviet family with all of their children, and the mother and the father is holding up a bottle of vodka. This is a celebration. The celebration was of no thing in particular, explained the article, and we will come to see why this is significant. Okay. So in my research, I'll be focusing on the relationship between excessive drinking and the government's vision of the ideal Soviet family and its function. The premise of my research is as follows. I contend that alcohol production inhibits the intended functions of the Soviet family, and the necessity for both to exist simultaneously was a fundamental flaw in Soviet communism and contributed to its downfall. Before I discuss the relationship between excessive drinking and the downfall of the family unit, it's necessary to establish the importance of the family to Soviet society, and specifically in perpetuating communism. The family can be regarded as the backbone of the communist society. They perform the hard labor and produce food and goods for the population and for export. In his book, Marriage and the Family in the USSR, Grigory Sverdlov emphasizes the importance of the family as a means for population growth. And I put a quote from his book on the screen here. As a result of World War II, the Soviet Union suffered an extreme population loss, which led to a lack of individuals able to work on the collective farms and factories to produce the necessary goods for the population. The Soviet family was therefore essential in reestablishing a significant population so that communism could thrive. Children were also necessary to perpetuate communism for the next generation as new members. The family also emphasized mutual aid for members. And this quote also from Sverdlov's book, he says, And I've indicated with the arrow, the first arrow, which quote I'll be reading here. The household economy and the care for members unable to work, children, old people, and invalids, is the concern of the family as a whole. In this way, the government absolves itself of any financial or social responsibility for the otherwise costly factors of elder care or care for the young or disabled, which forces the family to take on these increased financial burdens. The second quote I'd like to highlight is to the left of the second arrow and is as follows. The necessity of conducting petty household economy, in which mostly women are occupied today, of providing for invalid members of the family will become less pressing. This quote emphasizes the role of women in the Soviet family. Women bear the burden of running a household, raising the family, as well as hard labor, as Soviet society prided itself on gender equality. In this quote, we see the future tense being used to indicate a vague promise to lessen the burden on the backs of women at some point in the future, indicating the severity of the burden women faced at the time. Propaganda was used to convince Soviet citizens of the nobility of having such a large family. In Marriage and the Family in the USSR, the same book, love is connoted with marriage, and marriage is associated with reproduction. Ooh, sorry, it didn't go on to the next slide. And marriage is associated with reproduction as a way to achieve the most complete realization, which is the bottom line in this quote here, of the function of the family. Reproduction is heavily rewarded. In addition to financial benefits, women who had 5 or more children were awarded with the honor of mother heroine. Additionally, the function of women as mothers, household leaders, and laborers is justified under the guise of women's emancipation. Alcohol played a very important role in the Soviet economy and lifestyle. Gosplan and Gosbank, before I explain this slide, I want to make clear that those are government organizations that planned supply to the demand for spirits. So the Soviet economy is largely reliant on alcohol sales, which were controlled by the government industry of Gosplan. So the Soviet economy is largely reliant on alcohol sales. A Radio Free Europe research document, which is an excerpt from which I have pulled here, explains how by 1970, the distilling industry provided the largest income to the Soviet treasury of any single production enterprise in the entire economy. The government was also threatened by the economic losses that might ensue from an increased production of samogon, which is homemade spirits, in the case of an alcohol ban. And samogon is equivalent to moonshine, I guess you could say. It's very strong, and it's made using sugar, which was actually not, I guess, in abundance in the Soviet Union at the time, but there was sufficient amounts of it, so that this was a very valid fear of from the government. In addition to the financial benefits of alcohol production for the government, there were social benefits to alcohol consumption. A 1986 report by the CIA cites alcohol as a comfort to a widely discontent population, a diversion of frustration into apolitical channels, and as a substitute for consumer goods that were not available in the Soviet Union. The government also feared discontent should it challenge the ingrained drinking culture of the USSR. Unfortunately, this inability to take significant action on alcohol production resulted in an excessive drinking problem in the Soviet Union. From 1960 to 1968, there was a 60% increase in vodka output compared to only a 13% increase in population, which is significant because it indicates drastically increased consumption per the average citizen. Additionally, according to the RFE Europe research document that I highlighted before, as wages increase, so does alcohol consumption, which suggests an almost insatiable desire for spirits from the average Soviet citizen. The average alcohol consumption schedule was 8.4 versus 15 liters per person in the US versus the USSR in the 1960s. with consumption growing steadily since World War II. The chart on the right details this increase in alcohol consumption over time. As you can see, it increases steadily until the 1980s, the early 1980s, in which it finally somewhat tapers off. And from the 1950s, it is already at a noticeably higher point. So in a 1984 article in the leading Soviet psychological journal, it was stated that per capita alcohol consumption increased by 10.5% a year in just the 1950s. Despite these statistics, Soviet leaders made only weak attempts to control the drinking problem. In the 1986 report from the CIA entitled Gorbachev's Campaign Against Alcohol, it is asserted that the past campaigns of Khrushchev and Brezhnev failed in the face of government ambivalence and lack of commitment. Additionally, in some village, such as Panevėžys, a brewery was one of only a few buildings to exist, which encourages drinking as a recreational activity and indicates the importance of alcohol as an economic pillar. The lack of government intervention, along with these social issues, created a drinking problem that got increasingly worse until the 1980s. While the Soviet Union suffered in many ways from the excessive drinking of many of its citizens, one of the most destructive effects was the downfall of the family unit. Alcoholism was cited in the previously mentioned CIA study and by Soviet demographer Viktor Perevedentsev as a principal factor of growing divorce rates in Slavic areas. Divorce then led to broken families. One of the main causes of alcohol-related divorce was a drain in financial resources. The average unskilled worker earned about 300 rubles a month. Just 1 liter of schnapps cost 40 rubles a liter, and 1 liter of samogun cost 12 rubles. At this point, I'd like to cite a testimony from a Czechoslovakian woman who fled to West Germany after divorcing her alcoholic husband for using up both of their incomes to purchase alcohol. She became the sole financial provider for both her and her children, but ultimately realized that the best course of action she could take for her and for both of them was to flee to Berlin and leave her children behind with her parents. So the children had to grow up without either parent for support. As I stated in my thesis, my research indicates that the function of the family unit cannot coexist with alcohol abuse. The parent's ability to parent is diminished by excessive drinking. Not only do parents have a diminished ability to do their job as parents in consuming excessive amounts of alcohol, but the exhaustion of the husband and wife at the end of a long workday, coupled with the uncertainty of the future in a communist society, leads to a greater likelihood for drinking and a diminished appreciation for children as they become just another mouth to feed. This is evidenced by the failure of the government of government incentives to significantly increase the population and keep that increasing over the years in the post World War II era. Further, parents who drink excessively to escape their problems concerning their family drain precious financial resources on alcohol, which leads to increased resentment towards their family. Which consists of their spouse and or their children. Sorry, I just got a notification on the screen that Peter is trying to come in. I guess I'll leave that.
He's already in, so no need to worry about him. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks. Yeah, sorry. If Soviet family life needs to be built on spousal love and affection for one's children, as Sverdlov indicates in his book that I've cited several times, Marriage and the Family in the USSR, excessive drinking poses a direct threat to this function by threatening both spousal love and affection for children. Further, women are the heart of the Soviet family. Excessive drinking amongst women resulted in higher divorce rates. By the mid-1980s, 2/3 of divorced women were alcoholics. When husbands drank excessively, the women who, as a reminder, were in charge of child rearing, running the home, and doing labor for financial income, simply bore too much of a burden, and the family collapsed, as was the case with the woman who fled Prague to go to Berlin. I'd like to conclude by saying that because Because the USSR could not give up producing alcohol due to its economic impact, the government created circumstances that directly prevented the successful function of the family unit as proposed in Sverdlov's book, which was a very influential book at the time. The backbone of communist society, which was the peasant family unit, was therefore doomed to collapse. And now, as I said at the beginning, I'd like to highlight this photo again. And what I noticed about this photo after doing all of my research on this subject was that the father is holding up the bottle of vodka while his family stands behind him. And I think it's just very indicative of the importance that alcohol played in society, whereas family kind of falls to the background, as this is exactly what is happening in the photo. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Hannah. And obviously in the discussion, we will be looking to collect questions related to your presentation. Now let's go to the second presentation in the panel. I mean, according to the revised sequence that we're going by, and that will be Carol Louise ASHBY's presentation. And Péter, TAKÁCS, just a remark to you, because of course you couldn't join us earlier due to those technical issues. Your presentation is expected and will come third. So please stand by for that. Thank you. And Carol Louise, please take over the floor.
Thank you. I'm just sharing my screen. Okay. Do you see my screen?
Yes, I can see it.
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so hello everyone. Thank you so much for having me here today. My name is Carol Louise ASHBY, and I'm a CWAR Fellow at Columbia University. Today I'm going to talk about a topic that is usually reserved for James Bond movies and that has been quite underrepresented in the Cold War literature, and this is sexpionage. And more specifically, I will be looking at sexpionage in the aftermath of the sexual revolution in the 1970s in New York and Washington, D.C. So essentially, I will be responding to a central question. What was the impact of counterculture movements, such as the sexual revolution that happened in the 1960s, on Cold War espionage? And so how exactly those new methods, such as sexpionage, came to be about? My hypothesis is that the liberalization of certain sexual practices, such as the swinger culture, which we'll go more in depth later on, led to the emergence of new forms of sexpionage. Sexpionage can be defined as the use of romance, of sex, seduction, and intimacy to extort information from high-ranking officials or well-connected individuals. And in this presentation, I wish to focus mostly on New York City and Washington, D.C. Those cities were important economic, cultural, and political capitals, as you know. For example, New York City was considered the spying capital in the world, and this is partly due to the presence of the United Nations headquarters, which were a goldmine of information for the Soviet Union, and of course, one of the main hubs of Soviet spying. But I also chose those cities because they portray a brilliant intersection of social forces, such as the sexual revolution and espionage. So in the course of this presentation, I will first look at the social, cultural context of the 1960s and the rise of the sexual revolution. And then we'll look at more conventional techniques that were usually employed by sex spies, along with examples. And finally, we will delve a bit more into my case study, which directly shows the impact of the sexual revolution on a completely different kind of sexpionage, which we'll go in more depth later. So let's begin with discussing the context. The 1960s saw the emergence of liberation movements for women and LGBTQ+ communities in the US, mostly referred to as the sexual revolution. So those social movements mostly developed in Western urban and suburban centers. Of course, New York City was the largest epicenter. As an example, the Stonewall riots, which I'm sure you're familiar with, that happened in late June 1969, sparked in the West Village, and they eventually launched the gay liberation movement by gathering thousands of people on the streets in New York City over more than 3 days. However, although that is very interesting, the women's rights and LGBTQ plus side of the sexual revolution, I am mostly interested, for the sake of this project, in another element of the sexual revolution, which is the liberation of sexual practices and kinks. And indeed, the sexual revolution was characterized by new demands for sexual freedom and liberation, such as companionship, non-marital sexual liaisons, and of course, the swinging lifestyle. And since this revolution occurred in the context of the Cold War, and more particularly at the height of the Cold War in the 1960s, it did not surprise me that several elements were actually appropriated for spying, and mostly by Soviet spies. So for instance, intimacy or blackmailing a homosexual government agent or swinger parties were rampant methods used by spies at that time. So those methods that I'm going to provide a few examples for are rather conventional. But the point here is that those ancient methods took a complete other form after the sexual revolution. So first, let's go through one of them, one by one. So the first method really used in sexpionage during the Cold War was, of course, intimacy. Soviet spies would get intimate with high-ranking officials in the hope that they would spill the beans during pillow talks. What is interesting here is that it did not always involve a sexual encounter, but it could also mean simply dating, or it could even involve feelings. One prominent examples of that in Europe, for example, are Romeos, which were East German spies who were sent to West Germany to seduce a woman which they had carefully picked before. And they sometimes engage into decades-long relationship with those women. A more local example to the US is Jennifer Mels. She was a clerk typist in the South African embassy in Washington, D.C. But simultaneously, she had also been recruited by the Cuban intelligence services in 1967. Indeed, she had joined pro-Cuban revolutionary groups when living in Canada prior to moving to the US. Of course, she was an attractive young woman who had a specific method. She would go to diplomatic receptions thanks to her job, and she would look for praise to bring back home. As one archival document pointed out, conversations quickly turned to topics of interest to Havana. And she allegedly dated White House staffers, as well as multiple diplomats and high-ranking officials, trying to extract information from them. The FBI eventually arrested her in 1969 in New York after she was spotted with her handler, who was also a Cuban diplomat. But what is really interesting in this case, too, is that she was, in fact, she represents that bridge between Washington, D.C. and New York in terms of sexpionage, and she was going back and forth between the two. The second, more conventional, I would say, method of sexpionage is, of course, blackmailing. And that would happen mostly by using someone's sexual orientation as a blackmailing tool. So the most declassified, I would say, case in the CIA archives is Joe Alsop, which you might be familiar with. He was a prominent American journalist working mostly in Washington, D.C. And he was sent to Moscow in 1959 to give an interview with Nikita Khrushchev. However, later that night, he was approached by this handsome blonde Boris Nikolaevich. And after they spent the night together, Alsop was approached by the KGB, who threatened to expose him if he did not give some confidential information. In fact, the KGB had pictures. Well, Alsop is one of the lucky ones. He actually laughed it off and even made a joke asking for extra pictures of the encounter. It just goes to show how many men, did not have the same privilege to as Alsop, and of course fell for the KGB tactics. The third, I would say, method would also be sex parties and companionship to extort information. So here we have the case of Mariela Novotnia, also known as Stella Caves. She was born in Czechoslovakia and made her way into socialite parties in New York City in the 1960s. So she worked as a call girl from multiple New York City apartments, as well as a courtesan in the Corn Club in Washington, D.C. For example, she met and partied with JFK and, of course, many other prominent US politicians. And during her illustrious career, she really made her way into the beds of high-ranking government officials, carefully extracting information from them. Margela Novotnia was eventually arrested by the FBI and returned to London, where she had launched a career as a striptease dancer and prostitute earlier on. So those three examples provided a brief overview of how Sexpionage was conducting during the Cold War. However, this project is mostly constructed over one other form, which no longer involved one person, but a couple. And this is the swinging lifestyle. So suddenly, with the sexual revolution in the 1960s and then 70s, there was a sort of emergence or maybe democratization of new forms of liberalized sexual practices, such as, for example, swinging parties in the West. And of course, it was expected that some spies would use it at their advantage. And this is the case of Carl and Hannah Kocher. Carl and Hannah Kocher are highly documented in the CIA archives, and their story is really mind-blowing. They migrated to New York from Czechoslovakia in 1965. They had been trained prior to that by the Czech intelligence from 1962 to 1965. So they are what we call sleeper spies. In fact, they infiltrate the US as political refugees posing as anti-communist, slowly building another identity in order to one day start working as spies. And that's what they did. They both built a complete other identity in New York, posing as anti-communist. They eventually got naturalized American in 1971 and 1972, respectively. Carl used his whole new persona as an anti-communist to get a job at Radio Free Europe and later got a PhD at Columbia University. What I found also pretty ironic is that he also studied at the Harriman Institute in Russian and East European Studies at Columbia University. So he built this persona as an academic. And Hannah, on the other hand, worked in the diamond industry, which gave her great opportunities to travel and to carry large sums of money around, and of course, to make dead jobs for her husband too. Fast forward to 1973, when Carl starts working as a translator for the CIA. And so in his work, he had access to a lot of classified documents. He was translated documents that the CIA had from Russian to English. And in 1975, he was granted a high level of security clearance. So he had this job, of course, at the CIA, which gave him some, of course, important information. But on the other hand, the couple had another stable source of information. Every weekend, they would attend underground sex parties. They participated mostly in wife-swapping parties and group orgies. Hannah served as a sort of bait. She was gorgeous and often compared to a movie star. Of course, when they lived in Washington, D.C., they were regular at many places. So, for example, they used to go to the restaurant called The Exchange, which in the archives that I read is mostly known as the meeting point of capital couples who want to, meet after work. And it was also a meeting spot for swinger couples. They also went to Virginia's In Place, which seems like it was the main place where all the spying took place. The reason for that is that this club included many CIA employees, as well as Pentagon officials, reporters from major newspapers. There was also one US senator. And so that way, really coming as a couple allowed them to extort, I would say, even double the amount of information through either pillow talking, or it was a way for them to build some kind of leverage for potential blackmailing. However, by 1976, the CIA started suspecting Carl and gave him less and less work. So the couple moved back to New York and continued living their lavish lifestyle. Of course, they took their swinging lifestyle with them. In New York, they attended the New York Plato's Retreat and the Hellfire Sex Club. They also went to the Playboy Club and, of course, often came back and forth between New York City and New York. But at that point, Kocher had lost his CIA access, so he mostly relied on the people and the acquaintances that he had met informally in his after-hours activities. Eventually, in 1984, the FBI arrested the couple and was held for 2 years in prison. They eventually returned to their home country thanks to a spy trade between the US and the USSR. The Kochers are probably not the only couple who took advantage of this new counterculture scene in New York City and Washington, D.C. And those spy couples completely redefined the way espionage and blackmailing took place. And in fact, they completely exploited this new public expression of sexuality in the West. The fact that those types of sexual encounters became socially acceptable all of a sudden, thanks to the sexual revolution and reached the public eye, made it quite easy for spies to infiltrate as a couple without being suspected. And indeed, that was the case, because no one could have suspected that Karl and Hannah Kocher, who were posing as good Americans who had escaped communism, were in fact directly reporting for the Czech intelligence services and by extension, the KGB. So to briefly conclude, I would like to say that with the foray of the sexual revolution that took place in the 1960s, sex really found a rejuvenated public expression in the form of those widely attended swinger parties or even queer parties in the West Village. And the appropriation of this new liberated sexual environment by career espions marked, in my opinion, a watershed moment in the history of political sexpionage. That was a brief view of my project. Thank you so much for listening to me, and I would take any questions or suggestions. Thank you so much.
Thank you for another very interesting presentation in this panel. And let's move to the third presentation without further ado, so we can have the discussion sooner. And let's go to Péter TAKÁCS.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, just one more second, and just presentation.
You can see your screen. I can already confirm that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Just a moment.
Yeah, right on the left, az elejét is I think what you need.
Thanks. Hello and welcome everybody in this conference. My name is Péter TAKÁCS. I am a PhD student at the National University of Public Service, Doctoral School of Public Administration. My title is Cold War Trends in the Nuclear Age, Hannah Arendt's concept typology of the issue of the total war and political revolution. The beginning, Karl Philipp Gottlieb von Clausewitz, the wording advocated by Karl von Clausewitz is that war is merely the continuations of politics by other means. This thesis is the present days that from the invention of the atomic bomb, this view begins to fall. We cannot map the political experience of our era, not the mention of the government, not the institutions of the parliament system, not the face of democracy, and not the party apparatus, but as two influencing factors growing about them. In our case, the Hannah Arendt concept total war and the political revolution. What take two concepts about in common is that signs of violence and they be discovered in them. In war, the presence of violence is manifested in almost total danger that threatens humanity, nuclear energy, while in revolution the presence of violence manifests itself a multitude of aggressive actions. And can you see the voice concentration of political power means? Hannah Arendt, what is politics? Politics is a people pluralism. Arendt words it about being together and with each other. Since man is not self-sustaining, but depend on other for his persons, there must be some kind of permanence of presence that affects anyone. This is an Aristotle's definition of zoom politica, which Arendt according to. Since the man is not the political freedom is tied to the particular space content. Arendt said there is no optance in moral and political matters. What is the conception of total war and political revolution in Arendt topics? In just said a terrible disaster that turned the world into the desert and the earth into the lifeless matter. That would Arendt said to war and the bombs against Nagasaki and Hiroshima. War and revolution, yeah. War is a total war, and revolution in Arendt's way is a political revolution. According to Arendt, everything related to the public space, the world where freedom alone is possible, as free action beyond substances is political. Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the war of Arendt. When the atomic bombs was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Arendt said there's a moment for which is the case to be a public continuation of politics and what would happen those and after was see the Karl von Clausewitz's territory. This is my thank you for your attention.
All right, thank you, Péter. That was the full presentation, just to make sure, right?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And in that case, of course, we can open up the floor for questions and comments from the audience. And I would have some questions myself, but I wouldn't want to hold up anyone, and so I'll keep these for later. And let's have any question or comment that may be there from the audience. Olga Terenyevska, please go ahead.
Yes. Hello. Congratulations on everyone's presentations, and I have a question to Carol Louise about her presentation. I wanted to understand if there was an influence, and to what extent was this influence substantial to the environment from a possible popular narrative about the spies and the Sexpionage outlined in your research. For instance, you know, there are so many TV series that are just one is getting more attention than another, that are shaping the public perception of this phenomenon. And there is a problem of you know, cultural memory, because when fictional is intertwined with non-fictional and what people believe, it all becomes quite fragile and volatile. What about the time period that you had covered in your research? Was there any significant influence from popular media and fiction narratives on these categories?
Okay, let me just ask quickly if there's anyone else with a question or comment right now. Well, if not, then let's go on with the conversation.
Sure. If I understood correctly, Olga, you asked me, sorry, I couldn't really hear much. You asked me what was the influence of the environment on Sexpionage, or
Of fictional, of popular fictional media production, such as TV production or books read on these topics, on the public perception of.
Mm-hmm. Oh, it is true that it's overly represented in popular culture recently. I mean, for example, the film Red Sparrow that came out in 2018 is a representation of that. However, and I think also because of that, there is I think that people, you know, give maybe too much importance of that, or when actually Sexpionage was only 10% successful. It was not a really successful technique. I think it's a fascinating one, but it was quite, it was not the main, of course, method of spying. And I don't think, what I tried to do with this project is really just look at, you know, how the environment shaped the rise of new forms of sexpionage. But I definitely do agree that, I mean, right now there's a sort of revival of interest in those exciting Cold War topics. And did you have another question? I'm not sure.
Olga, feel free to follow up.
Yeah, please. Oh.
Yeah, that's the tricky nature of the kind of conferencing we're doing. But at least we got some, you know, dynamic going, and that's nice to see. We have another question in the meantime, so let's go to that. And maybe if Olga returns, we can continue that thread in the conversation as well. Farouk, can we hear from you?
Yeah, can you see and hear me well? I have two questions. Well, one question and one comment, rather. I also have a question to Carolyn first. Such an exciting topic. But I was wondering if you have any evidence of how the successes on the spy front on the Soviet side, whereas, you know, allegedly there was no sex at all, or at least there was a very cautious discourse on sexuality in the Soviet Union. Yeah. So how were the successes narrativized, if at all? If you have any evidence how it was publicly represented or among the professionals. So if you have any evidence how the Soviet counterintelligence were discussing swingers and homosexuals involved in the fight for the glory of their Soviet motherland. And then I also have a question to Hanna, also very exciting, and it has something to do with my own research, but it's very different because you're focusing on the Russian side of the Soviet Union, which I always try to kind of complicate because Soviet Union does not equal Russia. If anything, there was 1/3 of the Soviet Union population who were not Russian at all, neither culturally nor linguistically. And I have evidence where alcohol consumption was in many ways a productive and progressive thing, especially in Muslim Central Asia. I wonder if you read or have anything to do with the literature on how alcohol consumption was popularized as a strategy against religious piety. And there was such phenomenon, which also has something to do with the marriage patterns as komsomolskaya svadьба, or the komsomol wedding, in which in the Muslim periphery, in the countryside, weddings were organized so that alcohol, availability of tons of alcohol, and I have some on my slide to show that, was consumed publicly, sometimes in like a schoolyard, to demonstrate that the Soviet state is not afraid of the the pious intellectuals and religious activists' reaction. It was very interesting to see this phenomenon in the 1970s, and it precisely has something to do with how the Soviet Union positioned itself when it came to the its own understanding of family, the values of the family. And I suspect that it wasn't the West that was the counterpoint of this self-understanding, but the pre-Soviet period, in which there was such phenomenon as the extended marriage. And I have evidence in my field that there were people living like 3 generations together in one house with absolutely no privacy and almost no possibility for a divorce, because you're not married to one partner, you're kind of married to every other family member in that big place, and you have no place to go otherwise. Yeah. So in this sense, for them it was kind of a progressive, but today we think of it as a very conservative wedding pattern. What the hell, it's just 2 spouses, yes, no swinging involved. But back then it was like a serious progressive movement, especially in the countryside. So that's it. Thank you.
I think maybe Hannah should respond first, because we heard the last questions relating to her presentation, and then we could go back to discussing Carol Lewis's presentation, and then I'll have my questions as well eventually.
Thank you so much for your question. That was really interesting. I have to say I haven't read up much on the phenomenon that you were talking about, but I think it's really interesting that alcohol can pose somewhat of or be symbolic of a somewhat progressive movement. And I think my response to that would be, while socially alcohol may have been indicative of some kind of social progression, from an economic standpoint, I think alcohol consumption was extremely detrimental, and the family unit is actually very strongly tied to economics, because, as I said in my presentation, it is kind of, the peasant family is kind of the backbone of the communist society in the Soviet Union, as they do all of the farming and all of the production of the goods to consume and to export. And so not only does drinking, I read some sources as well from Radio Free Europe that indicated about the severity of drinking in the workplace and drinking on the job. So from that standpoint, it was a large economic loss, but also broken families mean less people to perform the tasks necessary to perpetuate communism. As we know, the goal of communism is it's like equality, for all, and equal access to resources for all. So people are needed to work the fields and to work in those factories to allow that equality to even have a chance at happening. And so when families break apart, and people, as the Czechoslovakian woman who I mentioned, when they flee or when when they encounter problems and they turn to alcohol as a way to solve those problems, everybody in the country suffers, because they stop going to work and they start draining resources, both financially and socially. And so while I do definitely concede that alcohol could have had some kind of social, been evidence of social progression, I think it's really interesting, especially what you were saying about the fight against religion. I think while it can be evidence of social progression, I think from an economic standpoint, and I'm arguing that the family is kind of tied into economics here, I don't think that alcohol is productive whatsoever. So that would be my answer to your question. Thank you so much for asking.
If I remember correctly, you asked me how how this kind of sexpionage was perceived by the USSR. And my response to this is that I found it very paradoxical with the general vision of, you know, sexual activity that was portrayed during the Cold War by the USSR. But actually those methods were very much so celebrated, and there was allegedly a whole training program that would selectively pick you know, women and male, so female and male spies, and they would undergo a training sometimes for even 2 years. The point of that was just to pick basically their prey, to study it extensively. And so it was fully known by the Soviet Union that was happening, and it was celebrated and trained for. What I also found interesting in my own research was how different men and women were treated in that realm. So most often female spies who would go abroad to conduct sexpionage would be expected, of course, to perform sexually, but they were also, if their task failed, which was often the case actually, they were completely, I mean, they were quite ostracized from society apparently, and not really supported by the intelligence services. So there were still elements of, I would say, Soviet culture, or just the way the government like treated sexual questions that were at play in that training, because men would be more on the sentimental side, and there are many cases of, you know, just men being expected to seduce a woman. So yeah, I hope I was able to respond to that question.
In the meantime, Olga seems to have arrived wherever she was going, and so Olga, you can follow up now on the earlier conversation. Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much, Martin. And sorry, Carol, Louise, I have been, my battery was out, and Microsoft Teams is far the best and most convenient platform for following conferences, especially if you are not a university member, which probably created some barriers for signing in. So I'm very sorry to take a long time. What I wanted to understand is basically if the narratives, popular cultural media narratives, like TV and maybe some fictional narratives, which were produced during the times of the Cold War about sex espionage phenomena, were they more, let's say, active there than they were now, and did they harm more than help, because there was lots of silencing in totalitarian regimes, while in the current democracies, where we know everybody well how much they are being distorted in Central and Eastern Europe especially, do you consider that these revived narratives about the spies and sexpionage, are they producing more harm than they are just doing for the freedom of speech and basically understanding of this phenomenon? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I do agree that the way it's portrayed today is sometimes very, I would say, like non-realistic or fantastical. And the reason for that, I mean, in my own research, I encountered a lot of setbacks, especially when looking at archives, because a lot of stories about spies are not quite yet declassified. And it's really hard to know for sure what happened, what was said. Most of what really I had as material were, you know, pictures and articles, and mostly secondary material. So the primary sources are very hard to find. And I think for that reason, popular culture nowadays do distort this narrative. I am not sure how much that is different from back then. All I know is that, I mean, I saw some posters of that were produced by the US showing, for example, like a beautiful Russian woman, allegedly a sex spy. So that was the kind of, you know, portrayal. I'm not sure exactly. I don't know if I can fully respond to that question because I'm not quite sure. But yeah, this is my take on it. Thank you so much.
Thank you also. Thank you very much.
Sorry? Oh, thank you. No worries.
I'm afraid we might have lost Olga again in this case. Well, I would want to have my questions at this point, and I can promise there's at least one person in the audience who still would have question or comment. We will have time for that. I mean, still, we have made up time on the previous panel, so I think it's fair enough if we stick around for a little longer. So I would have questions to all the presenters on the panel. And my first question and a comment as well will go to Hannah. So it's also related to the previous question that came up related to your presentation. And I think it would be very useful to address in this paper or related to this topic, the public health perspective as such, especially given that the Soviet Union had an acute interest in even advertising their public health achievements by the time of the 1950s, 1960s, thanks to vaccination campaigns and similar progress in other areas. And related to alcohol, I think it's a fundamental point to make that, for instance, in terms of the disease burden on a society, it contributes to increased prevalence of various forms of cancer. And there's really a host of issues to bring up from the public health perspective. So a discussion can be given to that. And I think it usefully complements the broader discussion as such. And the question is, because it seems like a really important variable or factor in the background of your paper, that the Soviet Union relied on revenues from the alcoholic drinks industry. How did this reliance evolve with time? Because, of course, if we go back to the 1920s, 1930s, it was even vital for the Soviet Union to go back to the state monopoly related to this. But how about later on? So how did that change proportionally, in terms of, other revenue sources of the Soviet state? Because I would assume that there might have been some considerable changes going on in that respect. And I would go next to Carol Lewis's paper. And an interesting question I would have is if you have any data on this or any assessment of this at this point, were Soviet spies involved in sexpionage used for classical honey trap operations or compromat rather? Or were they more involved in obtaining information, classified information from intimate sources that they were intimate with? So these two fundamentally different lines of operation, how did they relate to each other? How was the trade-off handled, and which was prioritized in given circumstances? That would be my question. And I would also have a question ultimately to Péter as the third presenter on the panel. So you, of course, cited Hannah Arendt's work on total war and even nuclear weapons. And I think it would be useful for the sake of the discussion to get your perspective. Do you sign up exactly to what Arendt said on these issues? Or how do your views diverge on the subject? That would be my question ultimately to you. Okay, and the floor is yours. Let's go, I think, to Hannah first.
Yeah, first I just wanted to say thank you very much for your suggestion. I think you're definitely right. And there was some really useful information I encountered regarding the detrimental impacts of alcohol consumption on the Soviet, the overall lifespan of people was actually decreased over the years because of alcohol consumption. And so, yeah, the Soviet Union was very reluctant to release statistics until about the 1980s on alcohol consumption over the past like 30 or 40 years. So I think that's a really interesting suggestion because it kind of directly contradicts the what the Soviet Union was trying to say about its public health system. So thank you for that. And to answer your question, I think that's a very interesting question. And while I can't say it's something that I've researched in entirety, what I do know is that Russia's main export today is crude petroleum, which however, like we've discussed though, that Russia is not equivalent to the Soviet Union. Like, and why I think that's important is that after the Soviet Union began splitting into different countries, each of those countries began a process of their own in deciding what they wanted to export and what they could export as a country, rather than having to function as just one leg of an entire legion of different countries and areas. And so I think over time, each individual area and each individual country got to specialize in what resources they had to export. And in addition to that, I also want to say that because of the population decrease in the post-World War II era, the Soviet Union encountered a lot of shortages of grain and food because there weren't enough people to to work in the fields to produce those goods. And so while I can't say what could have happened because it didn't happen, I do believe that there's a chance, if the Soviet Union hadn't suffered such a drastic loss in population, that they would have not relied on alcohol production so much. But because there was a shortage of things such as grain and food, and there was not as much of a shortage of things such as sugar, which was used in many instances to make distilled in the distilling industry to make alcohol, I think they more so heavily relied on that because those were the resources available to them in the largest quantity. And they did not have enough people to produce enough goods for the population of the country and for export. So they kind of turned towards what they could do, which was focus on the distilling industry.
Thanks.
I guess I'll go next. Thank you for your question. Actually, it's true. So there's very little data, or at least compilation of data, on what form of sexpionage did the Soviet Union prioritize. But as far as I know, it seemed like both honey traps and also intimacy in romance were used. I did observe some kind of trends. So for example, for honey traps, where it mostly consist of a sexual intercourse, it will mostly be about blackmail. And that will take the form of, a team operating, a woman seducing, and then someone taking a picture or something like a material to blackmail. And so it's kind of interesting how honey traps mostly relied on women, really, when intimacy or romance mostly relied on men. And I would say the most prominent example and where it really worked was in East Germany. And so those Romeos who went to West Germany, there are cases of, some who have established a long-term source of information, have done that for 4 decades, and were really intimate with their sources, so much so that it was quite hard for them to believe when all that, came out at the end of the Cold War, that they were actually spies, because they had no idea. So I think that just by how the nature of the job is done, like, I'm not sure which one has more importance, but I just observed those 2 trends that I thought were interesting. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. And finally, let's go to Péter then. Do we have Péter?
Yes, I have. Thank you for your suggestion. For your suggestion, I think what the war destroyed man erected, his conception is radically twisted in the nuclear age or atomic bombs ages, and Arendt typology is twisted in the modern political issue.
Okay, thank you, Péter. We have one more question, and that is going to be the last one. So make it count. Let's go to Hans' question.
Hi, thank you. My question is for Ms. Ashby. I was wondering, in the course of your research, if you saw that sexpionage is
We cannot hear you. It's
Hear
disconnected.
me?
I think you can hear now.
That's not me.
Oh, but probably another member of the audience is not muted at the moment, but I cannot find who it is. Can you try to say something, Han?
Hi.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Sorry. So my question was for Ms. Ashby. I was just wondering if you noticed sexpionage as a tactic diminishing in the period following the 1970s, where there was a combination of kind of the counter to the counterculture with the emergence of, the moral majority, Reaganism, and also the public health crisis of the AIDS epidemic. Having lived in DC for 10 years and having a focus on the kind of odder points of history, I know that many of the venues you discuss, especially the swinger clubs, suffered a major crackdown, not just in DC, but across the US, as part of mainly municipal authorities utilizing fear of the AIDS epidemic to do a vice crackdown. But I know the FBI also began aggressively pursuing people who they thought might be leaks, who might also have been exposed to AIDS. And also, I know that the Soviets reacted in a very paranoid fashion. When I applied for my student visa to Russia, I had to submit paperwork showing that I had had a blood test for HIV. So I was just wondering if you'd noticed any of this in your research and if you had any thoughts you want to share on it.
Thank you so much for your question. It's really interesting. I actually have not really read a lot about the 80s and 90s. I mean, I would assume that, of course, since there was a kind of a decrease of those practices, that sexpionage would also, in that realm, would also decrease. But really, I'm not sure. I'm just guessing. And also, I mean, it's quite hard to quantify the number of spies really who did this and where. Focusing on 2 cities was hard enough, because in the archives you find a lot of sparse information and spy stories. So I'm not sure in terms of the numbers. I would assume that sex spies in general, as I've seen in literature, were quite good at adapting to the circumstances of the time. And so I think I would expect a decrease, but honestly, I'm not sure. I cannot know for sure. But thank you. It's definitely something that I'll research more.
Thank you.
Well, it's time for me to thank everyone for their role in this panel, including our presenters who have given us really fascinating papers. I'm very much looking forward to reading fully developed articles on the basis of these papers one day. Definitely let me know if you get there, because I'm actually an interested reader, prospectively speaking. And of course, thanks go to the members of the audience who contributed with their questions, further stimulating work on these subjects. And now I think we have to hand over to Professor Békés